Welcome back to the channel. Today we will try to analyze the Friday's situation that took place in White House and discuss how it will affect the future of international diplomacy. Join us and enjoy the video. The White House Showdown, Trump, Vance, and Zelenskyy. A diplomatic reality show gone wrong. If international diplomacy were a Netflix series, last Friday's meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, U.S. President Donald Trump, and Vice President J.D. Vance would have been its most watched episode yet. Full of tension, unexpected plot twists, and enough passive-aggressive commentary to rival a Thanksgiving dinner at a dysfunctional family's house. But beyond the theatrics, this clash signals major shifts in U.S. foreign policy, the balance of power in Europe, and the future of the war in Ukraine. So let's break it all down. Zelenskyy, the unwelcome guest at the White House dinner party. It's safe to say that Zelenskyy did not receive the warmest of welcomes in Washington. The Ukrainian president came with one goal: securing continued American military and economic support for Ukraine's war effort. But instead of getting an open checkbook and firm handshakes, he found himself at the receiving end of a verbal firing squad. Zelenskyy, once treated as a heroic wartime leader on Capitol Hill, was now facing a U.S. administration that had grown impatient with the ongoing conflict. Trump and Vance made it clear that the days of unquestioned American generosity were over. The former comedian-turned-president found himself in the ironic position of being lectured by a former reality TV star-turned-president and a vice president whose foreign policy experience mainly consists of tweeting about how America should mind its own business. J.D. Vance, never one to shy away from blunt statements, took the lead in confronting Zelenskyy, accusing him of being ungrateful and disrespectful toward the U.S. The message was clear. Ukraine should stop acting like American support is a given and start showing some appreciation, or better yet, start thinking about a peace deal with Russia. This moment marked a stark contrast from previous years, when Zelenskyy was received with standing ovations and pledges of unwavering support. But that was a different era, back when the U.S. political class was united in countering Russian aggression. Now, under Trump 2.0, the focus has shifted from defending Ukraine to re-evaluating whether American involvement is even worth it. Trump and Vance, the new power couple of America First diplomacy. The most intriguing aspect of this meeting was the starring role played by Vice President J.D. Vance. Typically, vice presidents are more like supporting characters in international affairs, visible, but not stealing the show. Yet here was Vance, taking center stage in a confrontation with a wartime leader, setting the tone for what could be the defining foreign policy stance of the new administration. Vance's aggressive posture towards Zelenskyy was not accidental. It was a deliberate message to both Washington insiders and global leaders. Trump's administration will not operate on the old model of foreign policy. The era of endless foreign aid and military commitments is over. If a country wants U.S. support, it will have to prove its worth. For Trump, bringing Vance into this confrontation served two purposes. One, establishing Vance as the ideological enforcer. While Trump has always been transactional in his approach to foreign policy, Vance is the intellectual voice behind the new realist approach, which questions the need for American involvement in distant wars. Giving him a prominent role in this meeting showcased his growing influence. Two, making a public statement to NATO and Europe. If Trump had merely given Zelenskyy a private dressing down, the message might have been lost. But by allowing this confrontation to play out publicly, he ensured that the world, especially NATO allies, understood that the U.S. is no longer handing out blank checks. One thing is certain: if anyone in Europe still had doubts about the direction of Trump's second term, they don't anymore. The fallout: who wins, who loses. The immediate consequences of this showdown were felt across the globe. Here's a quick scorecard of the winners and losers from this diplomatic brawl. Winners: Vladimir Putin. The Russian president probably popped open a bottle of champagne after watching this unfold. A public rift between the U.S. and Ukraine is exactly what he hoped for. If American support for Kyiv wavers, Moscow has more leverage to push its own peace terms. That would likely involve Ukraine ceding territory and effectively accepting a Russian victory. For Putin, this is a strategic victory without having to fire a single additional missile. Trump's America First base. The spectacle of Trump and Vance scolding Zelenskyy plays well with the isolationist wing of the Republican Party. It reinforces the narrative that the U.S. should stop acting as the world's police and instead focus on domestic issues. The message? Ukraine's war is not America's war, and Trump is not afraid to say it. China, while not directly involved, China benefits from any division between Western allies. A weaker NATO and a distracted Europe make it easier for Beijing to continue its expansionist policies in the South China Sea and beyond. If the U.S. pulls back from global conflicts, China gains more influence on the world stage. Zelenskyy and Ukraine. Zelenskyy came to Washington hoping for support, but he left with a stern lecture and little reassurance about future aid. Worse, the public nature of the dispute could embolden European leaders who were already hesitant about continuing to send military and economic assistance to Ukraine. If U.S. support fades, Ukraine's position in the war becomes increasingly precarious. NATO and European leaders. For NATO allies, the Trump-Vance treatment of Zelenskyy is an alarming signal. If the U.S. is stepping back from its role as Ukraine's primary supporter, Europe will have to fill the gap. But with many European countries already struggling with economic slowdowns and political infighting, a coordinated response may be difficult. The divide between pro-Ukraine and more skeptical European nations, like Hungary and Slovakia, could widen, making NATO look weaker in the face of Russian aggression. U.S. foreign policy credibility. Like it or not, America has spent decades positioning itself as the backbone of the Western alliance. When a U.S. administration suddenly shifts course and publicly rebukes an ally, it sends a message to the rest of the world. America's commitments are conditional and can change overnight. Countries like Taiwan, South Korea, and Israel might start questioning whether they can truly rely on Washington in a crisis. What happens next? So where does this all go from here? Several scenarios could unfold in the coming months. 1. Ukraine forced to negotiate with Russia, with U.S. support in question. Zelenskyy may have no choice but to start exploring a negotiated settlement with Moscow. The problem? Russia will demand terms that are humiliating for Ukraine, likely including territorial concessions and guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO. Zelenskyy has resisted this idea for years, but if his biggest backer, the U.S., is backing away, his bargaining position weakens significantly. 2. Europe steps up, or tries to. The EU could attempt to fill the void left by the US, increasing military and economic aid to Ukraine. But that's easier said than done. Germany, France, and other major European powers have domestic challenges to deal with, and not all EU members agree on supporting Ukraine indefinitely. The risk is that Europe remains divided, with some countries continuing strong support while others push for negotiations with Russia. 3. Trump strengthens his anti-Ukraine stance. If Trump senses that his tough stance on Ukraine is politically popular, he could double down. This might mean not only cutting off aid, but actively pressuring Ukraine to accept Russian demands. In a worst-case scenario for Kyiv, Trump could even consider lifting sanctions on Russia in exchange for some kind of peace deal, effectively legitimizing Putin's invasion. Before, a major battlefield shift in Ukraine. If Ukraine starts running out of military supplies due to declining Western support, we could see Russian forces gain momentum on the battlefield. This could lead to more territorial losses for Ukraine and even the potential collapse of certain defensive lines. Number 5, a global power shift toward authoritarian regimes. Beyond just Ukraine, this moment could accelerate a broader geopolitical shift. If the U.S. is no longer seen as a reliable partner for democratic nations, authoritarian powers like Russia and China could gain more influence. Countries that were once firmly in the Western camp may start hedging their bets, seeking closer ties with non-Western powers to ensure their security. The bottom line, a new world order? The Trump-Zelenskyy confrontation was more than just a tense diplomatic exchange. It was a symbolic moment that could reshape the future of global power. The message from Washington was clear. Ukraine can no longer take U.S. support for granted, and the old rules of alliance politics are changing. The question now is whether Ukraine and its European allies can adapt to this new reality before it's too late. Because if the U.S. steps back and Europe fails to step up, the biggest winner won't be Trump, Zelenskyy, or NATO. It will be Vladimir Putin. And if that's the case, then Friday's Oval Office showdown won't just be remembered as a diplomatic dust-up. It will be remembered as the day the West started losing the diplomacy. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and share this video. See you in the next one.